All right, hey everybody. This is Chris Ferguson at Stetson University. Glad you all can join us. Hopefully there's anybody here. So first we get excited about actually having people in the room with us. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about, sort of the last 20 years of research in video games, talk about violence, talk about addiction, talk about sex, whatever you guys want to talk about. This is really kind of like a big Ask Me Anything sort of thing. And we have a panel of folks here that are ready and excited to talk about video game research. We wanted to get a panel of the best researchers together. They couldn't be here, unfortunately, but they got us, and we're free. So what we're going to do is start by going through. It's late over here. I'm in the United States. It's like almost 1 a.m, so I'm doing the best I can. So we're going to go through and introduce ourselves really quickly, and then we'll start in on some. I'm moderating apparently, not necessarily well, but I'm trying. And I'll ask a question of the group and ask a few more. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Twitch chat. Hopefully it's working for me. So we'll see if that is working. But so for myself, again, I'm Chris Ferguson. I'm a professor of psychology at Stetson University. I've done research on video game violence mostly, and some other areas as well for 15 or so years. It seems like a long time. I've also got a book, Moral Combat, Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. So if you think of it like I have a kid who's about to hit college, so think of it like a Patreon. If you want to support my kid's college education, that's a great way to do it. And from there, I'm going to go basically from west to east. Hopefully I have that right in my head. And I'm going to start right here in Miami with Lindsay Grace. If you can introduce yourself.
Great. Hi, I'm Lindsay Grace. I'm Knight Chair in Interactive Media at the University of Miami. I'm also Vice President of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance. I've been teaching and designing games for 15 plus years. I too have books. I brought one of them, Doing Things with Games, which you can barely see. And I have another, Love and Electronic Affection. Both are focused on sort of social impact games, and most of my research is in that area, trying to find efficacy through gameplay. And I think the only other thing I should mention is that last year I was awarded the Vanguard Award from the Games for Change Foundation for my work in social impact games.
Okay, so we are next going to Julia, who is in Germany, if I remember correctly.
Not correctly. Hi, I'm Julia. I actually live and work in the Netherlands, so this call comes from Rotterdam, Erasmus University, Rotterdam. But indeed, I'm German, so the accent is German, not Dutch, what you hear. I'm doing games research for 14 years now. I'm one of these junior researchers, or I used to be a junior researcher who saw these negative effects, and I thought this is strange, so what can we do about it? And maybe there's something wrong in the methods. I did not write books so far, but you can find a couple of publications on games and aggression, addiction, but also the positive side. Yeah, that's kind of me.
All right, super cool. So I can't figure out if Tasmania or mainland Australia is further east or west. So we're going to go with Grant DeVilly next.
Hey, okay, I'm Grant DeVilly. Doesn't matter where. I'm in Brisbane at the moment at Griffith Uni. So I'm a professor in clinical psychology, and my original background was in the field of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I helped write the treatment guidelines for the treatment of PTSD. As part of that, I started getting brought to my attention about how, it was an interesting question. Can someone be traumatized from playing a game? I said, well, what the hell are you talking about? And that sort of sucked me into the gaming area. And then I saw some of the outlandish comments that were being made that to me just didn't seem to square with what we knew about how anger, aggression and violence in that order create. And so I did games on violent video gaming. Does it make kids violent? We started looking at that. My claim to fame, which I'm going to use for every PAX I'm ever at, that together with Jeff Brand, we advised the Attorney General in Australia to bring in the R18 plus rating. We used to be MA 15 plus and then went to R18 rating. And I'll never forget, on the way to Parliament House, phoning up Chris and asking, okay, give me the dirt on anything that I don't know about before I go in. And ended up passing. So yeah, I'll talk later on about research we've got upcoming if there's time.
Sounds good. All right, awesome. And so we'll go to James Sauer in Tasmania.
Hi, yep, I'm Jim Sauer. I'm at the University of Tasmania. I guess one thing to know is I'm a gamer myself. I've been a gamer for like 30 years, since Alex Kidd on the Sega Master System 2. And probably like a lot of people who research video games and the psychology of video games, I got into it with an interest in the relationship between video game violence and real world aggression, and kind of a suspicion that perhaps the relationship between those two things was nowhere near as strong or as clear cut as some people were suggesting. So working with actually a couple of people here, Aaron and Chris, over the last few years, we've kind of run a few studies and done some meta-analyses, and, you know, surprise, surprise, the relationship's not as strong as people have suggested. And so once we kind of, I think, kind of nailed that one shot. I don't know if I can use that term. Before. But then got interested in how other aspects of gaming affect gamers, particularly like game design elements, reward systems in video games, how they affect gameplay and the way gamers engage with game content. And of course, that leads into pretty neatly the idea of gambling-like reward systems in video games, things like loot boxes, and again, how they affect players, and, you know, what we should, if anything, do about that. And that's probably a reasonable segue, I reckon, to move on to Aaron.
Very cool. Yeah. So bringing up the back end, certainly last but not least. I was going to say least but not last, but I wasn't right. Is Aaron Drummond in New Zealand.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aaron Drummond. I'm a senior lecturer at Massey University, and I work quite a bit with Jim on loot boxes in video games. But you know, much like Jim, got interested in the issue of video games and whether or not video games were associated with aggression. You know, around about the same time as Jim did. We published our first paper together in 2013 on that issue, and have been sort of working on it ever since. And as he says, you know, surprise, surprise, it's not kind of as strong as it may have appeared. And I guess like every gamer my age, I'm currently trying to recapture my youth by playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2.
Very cool. All right. We also got our first question, which simply is, do we use Twitter? So yes, whenever we're in a good mood, we want to get out of it, we go on Twitter, and that takes care of everything. So I don't know if other people can throw your Twitters into the Twitter account, whatever. I'm old, so just bear with me here. Into the chat. It's not letting me put anything into the chat, but if you guys want to do that, or just if you want to sort of slip your Twitter in somewhere into an answer, somewhat like, yes, violent video games are good. My Twitter account is blah, blah, blah. That's fine. Mine is CJ Ferguson 1111. Pretty simple. So you can find me on Twitter pretty easily. But the rest of you can just slip it in somewhere. So let's go ahead and we'll start with a question for everybody. People just kind of jump in and you know, go ahead and answer however you want, whatever order you want to do. And again, for people who are watching, people who are listening, please feel free to toss us some questions on, you know, I won't say ask us anything as an invitation to disaster, but ask us anything on video games that we can reasonably answer, you know, without offending, you know, the rest of the world. So let me start by asking the panel. So I think we're all kind of used to this idea that, you know, video games are always, you know, or gamers are always being blamed for a variety of social ills. So do we think that in the future, I mean, is there a trajectory? I've been doing this for 15 years. A lot of you have been doing this for a while as well. Do you see things getting better? Are we going to get to a point, do you think, where people stop blaming video games for everything that's wrong with the world today?
I've got a quick answer to kick us off, actually. I wrote a different article sort of for public media maybe about a year ago that actually traces the trajectory of blaming games all the way back to the Buddha. So there's actually these sort of religious writings that complain about board games being a problem for people, a habit-forming disease of culture, and then you can find it over and over again. I think one of the most interesting things is games have often been the scapegoat for any kind of social issue that a politician or group of people with a political agenda tend to blame. So it was dice rolling with the Romans, and they were like, this mix of fate is an issue, and it just keeps coming up anytime we need that scapegoat. So maybe as long as scapegoats are around, games might be blamed until there's a better one.
I would actually add, I would actually add to this that it's not only games, but media in general, especially new media, is always blamed. I mean, starting with the book print, that everybody, that females won't feed their children anymore because they get addicted to books or something like this. Then also books written by Goethe in my home country, Germany, then, he commits suicide. So all young men who will read this book will commit suicide. So I think this is not only games, it's a blame on any media, especially new media. So it's an age-related thing. If I don't know it, I fear it. So that's my answer to this.
Yeah, I agree with Julia. I think she's hit the nail on the head there and taken a number of the things I was going to say as well. But I'd also add that we see an evolution over time in what we blame. So, we're no longer seeing people blaming violent movies as much and sort of violent TV shows as much. They've become more kind of accepted. And now it's moved into more the interaction media. So I think wherever media goes next is where we'll end up blaming the next problem on.
Yeah, I always think as country music is really to blame for most things that are wrong in the world. I think I'd be much more open to the idea of I don't think we would have all the chaos in the United States if it weren't for country music, but we'll see. So, all right, so we have, let's see. So Lantre is asking Grant specifically, was it hard getting Australia to do the 18 plus rating for games? Because you were involved with that, Grant.
Yes, it was very hard. But there were people that were...
Oops.
That was a dramatic pause.
He was cut off. Australia is just nope. Unacceptable question.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's one way to avoid answering the tough questions, right?
Am I back? I think I'm back, am I?
Yep.
Yes, you're back. I think you get censored. I think your answer isn't 18 plus. I think that's what happened here. So.
There was a lot of the thing about, we had ministers that were interested, had actually read the research that we gave them, but more than that they were being informed by very well informed advisors, and it's those advisors that are in the ministers' ears. They were the people that had the largest impact. They selected me to be one of the people to be coming along. So I say I helped, but really they got it done. And those advisors that are in the.
Oh, did we lose him again?
No, I'm still here. Yep. So the one thing I will say is that everybody got a say in front of the ministers, including some really interesting groups of people. And building on what Julia and just said, and Aaron just said, it is an attack on youth rather than any other group, because I also do research in the alcohol industry, or in the area of nighttime entertainment districts, and how drunk people are coming in, going out. I'm in Queensland. The Australians will know about this already. In Queensland, there's been a lockout there, even before the pandemic. There was a closing down of the night, and exactly the same reasons were used for that as are used for violent video gaming. And the most recent version, and this is what made me a little bit nervous when I heard it, is that there's a difference between assaults and extremely violent assaults, and we should look at that. And these extremely violent assaults will disparately affect women. And then I heard exactly the same arguments being used just recently in Australia to try and bring back the R18 rating. And being used on the Attorney General, saying it's extremely violent games that are the problem, not just violent games, and that will have the worst effect on women. So it was too similar at the same time. So that's my thing. I think we need to be wary of. Yes, I think it's a coherent attack on the youth.
Okay. Cool. Any other thoughts from the panel before we move on? Okay, hearing silence, I will move on to the next question. By the way, Gamer Girl is saying that they can't see us anymore. I don't know if that's been fixed. I know we're all so good looking that really people are here to watch us, not listen to us. It's really not the same if you can't see our adorable faces, but hopefully they can get that fixed for people. But okay, so from Straight Jacket Jim, I love that name. Is he apparently is playing a bit of devil's advocate? He says, and he asks if there are any legitimate studies that lean towards violence in video games causing issues. So what do people think? Do we are there any good studies? I think is what he's asking. There are obviously studies that claim to find effects, but I think he's asking, are there any good studies that?
Well, Chris, this would actually almost be a question to you, right? Because you did a lot of meta-analysis on studies like this. If there is anything or not, maybe I can answer for you a little bit, because there's also one question I saw in the chat that kind of hints towards the same direction, saying that there's almost always a problem with the methods, and I must totally agree with this. So it starts already, how do we measure aggression in a laboratory study? Or also in a field study, how will we do this? Because it's an ethical issue. You cannot just ask people to be violent, this is not possible. So there are a lot of problems, of course, in the control variable, and also if there is an effect found, you also need to ask who is the egg and who is the hen here. So what is the cause and what is the effect? This is a very difficult situation. So as far as I know, I don't know any study who really has it proven. And if you put them all in one mix, you find maybe little tiny effects, but the effect size of it is so small that it can be ignored. Because if you also look at sports research, you find bigger effects at sports, like real life, physical sports can make you more aggressive than actually violent video games, compared to,
Yeah, I think, to sort of throw in my 2 cents for what it's worth, I think, Aaron and James and I just did a meta-analysis that got published this year in Royal Society Open Science. I kind of looked at that. These are all long-term outcome studies of violent video game play and aggressiveness in players. And one of the things we looked at was essentially a quality analysis, so we looked at certain things that, at least that we felt were pretty important for high quality studies, and overall found that the higher quality studies were less likely to find evidence for effects than were lower quality studies. Can we say there's not a single halfway decent study that has never found effects? I don't know that we would say that exactly, but there definitely seemed to be a correlation between quality and likelihood of finding effects, and in the opposite direction from what maybe you would hope if you were worried about this. So better quality studies were less likely to find evidence, and I think that's actually a consistent thing we're seeing in psychology in general now, not just in violent video game research, is that oftentimes people's beliefs on what happens in human psychology and psychological research or that's a whole replication crisis, right? That basically a lot of really kind of poor quality studies, you really should, if you take an introductory psychology, you should ask for about half to 2/3 of your money back, because they're kind of saying that about like a half to 2/3 of studies don't replicate at this point. So that's where we're kind of at now. So I think that the violent video game and other sorts of related fields are in there. Did I hear somebody jumping in on the panel? Or was that just like a groan at my jokes? Might have just been a groan at my jokes. That's fine. So that's bound to happen. Okay, so let's see. So from Darty BH, I apologize, by the way, if I'm a terrible moderator. So if I'm missing people's questions, please feel free to repost them. I'm not trying to skip you on purpose. Or maybe I am. We'll never know. That's the power of the moderator. So Darty BH asks, screens have become ubiquitous in day-to-day life. We often hear in mainstream media about screen time limits for children. Is there any research that indicates a correlation between heavy childhood gaming and negative long-term outcomes? So if anybody wants to jump on that one, please feel free.
I'll go in. To my knowledge, that hasn't been looked at specifically, and it's very difficult to look at that. And the reason for that is by the time you get people where you're entitled to research them, you've got whole heaps of other factors taken into account. In our research, we found that gamers actually had less of a reactivity. They had less aggression, less reactivity. And I think in yours, one of your studies, Chris, there was increased positive attitudes towards other people, wasn't it? I believe they actually showed pro-social elements, and that's the trouble. And if you looked at the amount of gaming they'd had in the past, screen time is something that's, at the moment, I'm thinking you'd need to take into account the amount of time children spend not just playing games, but YouTubing. So TikTok, YouTube, all this lot, they spend an inordinate amount. As a son, if I have a son who's 13, comes home, his immediate de-stress is to sit down and watch YouTube for a while. And this is what they do. So that'd be very hard. I am concerned, as a site though, that if they only do that and don't have social interaction, if they don't have those learning processes, not just with friends, real physical friends, but also with family members, then I'm concerned that we might not be giving our children the best start. But anyway, others might have a different opinion.
That's the I think that's the thing that I think worries me if we look at it in the contemporary, is that a lot of our research is on game playing. It's not on game streaming and game watching. And with a cultural shift where you have gamers who are consuming and not necessarily actively playing and socializing through the games or socializing in different ways, looks like we're going to have to do more research.
This is how we stay in business. It's always a scam. There's always more research we need to do. It's just sending us grant money. We're never really sure. No grifters, really. Oh, that's cool. All right,
Chris,
yeah, go ahead.
with your earlier, it was mentioned about people having a. Is there any good study that's had the opposite effect? One of the things I would add to that, the reason. There have been studies that found the other way, but it's a matter of what are they measuring. Mm-hmm. So very often we're in a lot of our measurements in the past of aggression and what have you, we're actually measuring frustration with the gameplay. And I want the gamers here to imagine that they've just gone on to an experiment. They've sat down and they've been told that they're now going to play this game. And you've just literally learned the mechanics of it. You're 15 minutes in, it comes to 20 minutes and it's stopped. You've only just learned how to do it and now you have to leave and fill out a questionnaire. And that is what all the old studies did. And of course, people were pissed off. It was they've got 20 minutes a game. They'd only just learned how to play the game. And then they got told to stop. And then it said, how angry are you? And they're all very angry. And then it said, right. So all the people who played the violent video games were really angry. All the people that sat there watching a 20-minute episode of Friends weren't angry. You know, it's about the quality of the study, exactly as you mentioned. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to that, Grant? Because I think you're spot on there when you think about what are you actually seeing, you know? And so you know, I'm a parent. I've got a 6-year-old boy. He plays video games. He likes his screen time. He jumps on YouTube. And sometimes when I ask him to stop playing video games or to put the iPad down, because, you know, come have dinner, clean up your room, whatever the case is, he's not a fan of that decision. He thinks I've made a poor choice and he expresses his displeasure, right? Now, if you've got in your head this idea that screen time is bad for kids and screen time is addictive and then the first thing you think is, oh, ha, ha, look at that. That's a behavioral response that someone would make if they were addicted to technology. I bet you it's the video games. But he'd do the same thing if he was playing outside or if he was playing with Lego. What you're seeing there is the frustration of somebody else telling you to stop doing something you enjoy and go and do something else, right? But if you don't approach it with the mindset of thinking about those alternative explanations for what you're seeing, it's really easy to latch on to those kind of intuitive ideas that float around in the popular media and interpret things in line with that kind of narrative. So that's something I'm conscious of as a parent watching my son engaging with that kind of technology.
And that experience you describe is exactly what we in trying to do educational games, for example, are trying to hit, right? It's that I wish that a child who were playing piano were just angry that you said, no, you need to go eat now. It's like, no, I want to play more, right? We're trying to play to that. And so studying and understanding what's keeping them there is also beneficial.
Yeah. We actually tested one study where we had 20-minute play versus a 50-minute play. And we showed that we've got much heightened arousal levels and, you know, the same results as kind of Anderson if we pissed them off and stopped them after 20 minutes. But we didn't get that if we gave them over 50 minutes. So
I would like to add something here as well to Grant, because I totally agree with you that it is frustrating if you just learn the game mechanic and then you have to stop. And in one of my studies, we actually let them play also 1 hour, so they could get used to it quite well. And what we actually found, because we kind of challenged them in one part, in one group, way more, like it was way more difficult than in another group. And what we figured out, at least when it comes to after game emotions, that you need challenge a little bit. So it can also lead to frustration if it's not difficult enough, if it's too easy. So it's not only the difficulty level or the violence level, but is it really at your level that you get challenged, and not too much, but also not too little. So this is what we found. If gamers, or if anyone, gamer or not gamer, has enough time to get adapted to the mechanics, I would, and maybe just a small thing to the screen time, because I get also this question very often. I have a young child of 4, and other parents ask me, what is enough or not enough screen time? And I say, as long as it is not the babysitter and exchanges your quality time or the kid's real engagement with other people quality time, you're on the safe side. So there's no real answer to how many hours is okay or not okay. It's more like, do you still have family time? Do you still engage? Do you still know what's going on? Because family time can also mean playing a video game together. So that's also screen time somehow, but in a different way.
I want to know if any kid ever has thrown a tantrum when they've been asked to stop playing the piano. Stop playing the piano. It's video game time. Like, oh, come on. Will we be talking about like piano addiction, if that was the case for...
That can happen, but not too many.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so we have a question from Gamerjet Girl, and she is saying she's writing her thesis. Woohoo! Good luck with your thesis, first off. And she's saying she's being a bit cheeky, and she wants to know, do we feel that people are choosing to play games as a modern day ritual? That's kind of interesting. Okay, so she's saying she's writing her thesis on the role of ritual in video games. So are people choosing to play video games as a kind of modern day ritual? And go to the panel. What do y'all think about that?
That's a very Digger question. That's a very game studies question. More of the social sciences. It's an interesting one. I think my immediate response is that some elements. I think you're talking specifically about digital games, because on the anthropological history side, and I have this in one of my books, 2 of my books actually, and if you read anyone like Stetson Smith, what you'll see is that they are, of course, ritual, right? There are lots of rituals attached to them. When I teach students intro to game design or intro to game studies, for example, there's a whole conversation I have about the ritual of the Olympics and the ritual, like all the pageantry that comes with a lot of the ways we play before digital. So I think your question's maybe more specifically to digital play, and I would say there absolutely is. And it's also a cultural space, and there are lots of folks who are doing research in that area, everything from what happens in game to what happens outside of game, like digging through the cultures and subcultures of certain, online communities and affinity spaces and all these other ideas. So that's like a broad, sure, yeah, ritual, yes. But I don't know if you need more specific than that.
Very cool. Other thoughts from the panel?
Probably some games.
Can I ask a noob question?
Sorry, you go, Jim.
No, you go, man.
I was just going to say probably some games are more ritualized than others too. Like it probably depends on what games you're playing. We were talking about Dark Souls before the panel started, and that whole cycle of play of go X far, die, repeat, learn what the actual mechanics are, and do it again is very ritualized in that sense. So some of the games out there are probably a little bit more ritualized than others.
Probably true of all Massacre too, right?
I was just going to ask that, to express my own kind of naivety in the area, but how do we define ritualistic in this context? What does that mean?
It's Satan.
I kept my mouth shut.
I've never gone out and made a sacrifice to the pagan gods, and then now I'm going to win 2K20. But I just wonder what kind of aspects make a behavior ritualistic in this context.
I thought the same thought actually, because brushing your teeth in the evening is also a ritual somehow. So, and it can be a social appointment ritual wise, like meeting your friends online, for example, and then of course it's ritualized somehow. And I'm just thinking about also that the WHO actually asked us to play video games and not drink wine during the pandemic because it's healthier. The ones who actually came up with the whole game addiction term. So this was kind of very funny. So they asked us to ritualize playing video games instead of ritualize drinking wine in the evening. So I thought that's funny, but it's indeed a question what this person means with rituals. So this is probably something she's going to define in her thesis, and then we can answer this question actually.
For her thesis, I might point you, I did a review of a book that was literally about digital games and religion, and it actually has chapters that are on religion and religious elements folded into both popular and independent games. And then there are cultural traditions that use everything from like the dreidel to other sort of toys to also communicate religious aspects. So if you're thinking religion and ritual, there's also loads of literature on that as well.
All right, very cool. All right, so our next question is from Res Intern, and it says, I've noticed games recently using euphemisms and using terms like defeated or eliminated. I question whether this actually serves any measurable purpose, probably not, or if it's a kind of security theater using those terms instead of kills or deaths. So in other words, you shoot your enemy and they're gently retired or something of that sort. So is this I guess why are games doing this as opposed to just simply saying you killed your opponent? Or I don't know. What do y'all think about that?
I think this is just a generic thing that's happening in society at the moment. Many years ago, I was actually in the British Army, but of course, we don't have soldiers anymore. We have peacekeepers. Where I live on acreage, and we used to have a sewage truck come and check the grease traps and take the sewage away. But he's now called Lee's Environmental. So, we're getting lots of these sort of. I suppose, what would it be?
Euphemisms?
Yeah, ostentatious euphemisms even, yes.
As a good example of that, I had a colleague who does games research in Canada who's asking a question on Twitter today or yesterday about some terms that they're not comfortable using with Americans, and one of them was bullet points. And they were looking for another word to express bullet points because we want to try and take that language out.
Okay.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent though it is a new thing in games. I mean, GTA has always used the term wasted, right? Like GTA, at least going back to GTA 3, and that was early 2000s. And I'm assuming there were kind of other games using similar kind of euphemisms then too. So I don't know. I'm not aware of any data on the issue, but it would be interesting to know if there's been a shift there, and if it is, as you say, Grant, just a kind of what's the word I'm looking for there? Kind of a softening of language around potentially tricky points. Yeah.
Actually, Jim, I think you hit it though. I think we can't forget that the marketing is also part of it. So wasted versus fatality are very much aligned with intellectual property. So there is also an opportunity in saying, oh no, I do eliminations in this game and I do something totally different in that game.
I think possibly part of it is the move towards esports culture as well. I mean, you tend to see eliminations used more in the esports oriented games like Rainbow Siege 6 and things like that, talk about eliminations rather than kills, I think, if I recall correctly. But, more of those kind of esports games tend to use the more sports-like terms. So that might be part of it as well.
Very cool. All right, so our next one, really, this will be a meaty question, I think, to dig into here. So Champagne Gamer is asking about what about impacts on other antisocial behavior? So for instance, if games have a lot of misogyny or racism, does that impact the player?
I can talk about one.
Go ahead, Grant.
I can talk about one where it's still in submission at the moment, where we we were looking at whether violent video games make people violent and what does predict violence and aggression. And so we had measures of personality, game mechanics, everything, but we had to have everything across the board the same level. So we compared a violent video game versus a TV channel, a TV show versus a violent book versus Portal 2, which was our control condition. And the game the TV was Game of Thrones, and there was nudity and, well, sexism was rife in it. So we used Duke Nukem as the violent video game with a naked patch applied to it, because at the time when we did this, it was only MA15 plus in Australia, so we couldn't have the R18 rating ones. So that's how we got around it. Looking back, I really wished that we'd also measured attitudes towards women, which we didn't at the end, before and after gameplay, obviously. But we did that as a measure of comparing. And we didn't find, on aggression at least, there was no difference amongst any of the conditions. The one that people were most, it was very often used that people are more in the moment when they're playing violent video games, therefore it has more of an effect. We found actually that's not true. It's actually when people are reading a book and watching a TV show that they're more involved with what they're doing. But I don't know if any of you guys have actually measured the effect pre and post on that. We really should have measured rate myths. So the one that should have been done, and I've done it in another study with police, was we should have given rate myths before and after, or just afterwards, to see whether that had actually affected.
Well, I was part on also an international comparison when we kind of assessed morality, but here's also again the question how to assess morality. After all, so we used a scale for this, and it was about Grand Theft Auto, and there was a manipulation about sexism in the game. We did not find anything. That's the one study I was involved in. And also if I look at other studies when it comes to morality and how games have impact on morality, it's similar to the aggression research. There's hardly anything, and also always questionable when it comes to measurements. So that's my point of view right now. Yeah.
I mean, we've done some studies at Stetson on mostly on the sexualization side, looking at, and with both male and female players in different studies. So some of those are kind of like survey based, where you kind of follow people over time. And we did do an experiment looking at sexualization in games on female players, and we're doing one now looking at male players. And most of the ones that we've published so far, sort of indicate that sexualization in games probably doesn't have much impact on players. So it seems to be kind of similar to the violent video game debate, in that sense. We haven't done anything with race, so I can't really speak to race in games. But in terms of the sexualization, it didn't make the women players either more aggressive towards other women or affect their body satisfaction or anything of that sort. And with male gamers, we don't find associations between, playing Grand Theft Auto or other sexualized games and increased sexism or decreased empathy, or stuff like that. So I don't know if other people on the panel have different experiences with that. And the question was followed up by a follow-up question by Resin Turin talking about like positive portrayals. I just wanted to speak to that a little bit. And this is where I mean, again, maybe other panels will disagree with me here. And I think I would actually disagree with some of the other panels that apparently Resin Turin has seen. And I don't know that there's evidence to suggest that having positive portrayals in fictional media in and of itself causes reduced racism or sexism. I don't know that I've seen evidence that would convince me that that is the case. I mean, it's kind of like always the question of, did will and grace, lead to gay marriage, and I think that's kind of a popular belief, but I don't know that there's evidence to suggest. I've actually kind of looked at that question kind of specifically. I don't know that, positive portrayals have that kind of impact. It probably feels good for the people who are being portrayed. So it probably is a nice thing in that sense, that people want to see themselves represented in fictional media. And it's good for that reason, I think. In terms of having an impact on audiences in general, I don't know that we have evidence to suggest that, societal attitudes are shaped in a powerful way by fictional media, as opposed to, so it's always the old, mirror versus causal effect. Is it sort of mirroring changes in societal attitudes, or is it causing them? And I don't know that we have the clear answer to that question. But do other people on the panel disagree with that? I certainly would open that up to conversation if people have different thoughts about.
One of the areas I published in for several years is persuasive games basically designed to change your interest, activities, or opinions. And I can be honest with you in saying that while we want the affirmation to be true, it is very, very hard to change people's opinions through games. And we have really hoped, and there's a lot of effort being done in this space, and the most effective evidence tends to be on short play games that give you a quick perspective on empathy. And I think one of the most compelling is a game called Spent, where they actually noticed that the people watching people fail at Spent felt worse for people in the situation Spent portrays than the actual players. So watching the failure and saying, oh my God, this is an unwinnable game, made people increase their empathy as opposed to feeling enabled and playing. But essentially in the persuasive game space and the persuasive play space, there's a lot more hope than evidence.
Yeah.
That I can add to this because I supervised a PhD candidate on this. Actually, he did a lot with persuasive games, and it's hard to really figure out which mechanism or what you need in the narrative or something to really persuade someone against or forward. And I would also agree with Chris that if it comes to portrayal of something, it's good for the in-group. So if this is my in-group, then I feel better afterwards if the portrayal was nice, and if it was not so good, then I feel maybe less self-esteem, more social anxiety and things like this. But for an out-group member who has a clear opinion about that group, that's very hard to change attitude. And we find this in the whole persuasive gaming pretty much similar.
Okay. Well, it was a bit of a bucket of ice water, I think.
Oh no!
We're just curmudgeonly about everything here, you know. Anyway, so unless anybody has anything else they want to add, let's move on to the next question. So,
because I want to add something to the bucket of ice water, because we cannot always say there is no negative effect, but totally positive effects. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's not how it can work, right?
I think explicitly caught myself. A good example, maybe this is a way to pick up that, warm that water up. Is I know that when I was very frustrated with all the literature around games and violence, I had created a game explicitly, Big Huggin', that was about like, let's make your solution hugging and love. And I studied all these affection games and thought, fine, if you're going to say that violence makes people violent, if they are hugging a lot, are they going to go around and hug people everywhere they go? And of course, there is no evidence that happened. So there is a sort of opportunity to make more interesting play, but it doesn't, our hopes for that kind of impact are still hopes, but we keep doing it. We hope to get to the moon. Some days we do get there. So I think this is, the positive side is that there's interest and possibility in that space. We just haven't done a great job of proving it. But 20 years ago, if you asked someone to make a persuasive game, they'd kind of look at you, and even though they may have played Monopoly and didn't understand the history of Monopoly, it's a persuasive game and it's a success. Most people would look at you and say, that sounds crazy. I can barely play Pac-Man, right? Like, we need some time for it to grow.
I guess I reckon that's a really important point too, is that in a lot of cases, what we're talking about are societal norms and attitudes that shift slowly over long periods of time, and generally speaking, it seems that if you can get more representative portrayals of different groups into media, that might over time contribute to those positive shifts, but it's certainly not going to happen quick. And it's not necessarily going to be the main thing, but it might be helpful. But like you say, there's an absence of good data to support that at the moment, right? It's more hopes than actual data.
Yeah. I think today that hugging video game would be a violent video game, right? Because you're actually spreading COVID-19.
Indeed.
Anyway. All right, so the next question is, this is interesting. So this is from Vidya, and she or he asked, is there a different impact between single-player gaming and multiplayer games? And does that change if the game is co-op or competitive? Have there been any studies that have investigated this? So anybody want to jump in on that question? Nobody likes. All right, we're gonna move on. Next question. No, I just we're all just shy.
We didn't
I would say. Go ahead, Grant.
We didn't compare between single player and group play, but what we did do is take into account kill ratios and stuff like that with real players and versus when they were playing computers, and we tried to make sure, because we had a couple of scenarios where we didn't have enough. Whenever you do an experiment, you've got 4 people. You can't just have 4 people playing each other in arena, and then in another condition, only 2 people playing each other. So we needed to keep it. So we stuck them in with bots to keep it all level. And again, wasn't single versus multiplayer, but it was for us. It was the kill ratios that was the best predictor of how people did. or is it now called life challenged ratios?
Yeah.
We haven't done a direct comparison, and I'm not aware of one that has.
Yeah.
I actually think that's one of. I think the issue of multiplayer gaming is a really important area for research at the moment. I think when we talk about the potential positive aspects of being a gamer, and how those might be amplified by online gaming communities and multiplayer online gaming, and if we talk about some of the potentially less positive aspects of gaming, frustration related issues that might lead to maladaptive cognition or whatever, again, perhaps in online multiplayer gaming, there's a potential for those things to be amplified. But we really don't know much because it's super duper difficult to create those kind of situations in controlled testing environments. Like Grant was saying, so we can maybe do some survey stuff, and we can see how people feel about their experiences in online versus single multiplayer versus single player. But we can't get that good cause and effect that we like in science because we just can't create the necessary conditions in the lab. So there's going to be, I think there's a real need for some creative research design to start tackling that question, because I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done there. That's my view anyway. I don't know if others have a different view.
Yeah, I think go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I just add to that. I think the one area we are getting some good data out of is cooperative games, and we do see with cooperative games like Left 4 Dead and things like that, where you have sort of 4-person cooperative teams. There's some emerging data that suggests that cooperation does actually tend to increase a little bit among the players, and also outgroup bias tends to go down a little bit among those players. And that's probably because those kind of cooperative games are a little bit more, I guess, realistic in the sense that the players are actually engaging in a real cooperative behavior. They're genuinely helping each other out as opposed to a fictionalized behavior. And so that might actually increase sort of opportunities for cooperation within the game and then beyond the game as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I might be able to add a little bit, not from game studies, but what we know from like studies with movies when it comes to CGI. If a character is kind of a computer program thing, but looks real, and if people know if this is real or not, that makes a lot with you. Like badass, even in Star Wars, if you know it's CGI, the badass can be bad. So you forgive more. But if this is a real actor, then you're more critical with this character even behind. This is very interesting because it's a very fictive story, but we found really effects on that. Like, was this ethical, this behavior? And you don't care so much if you know this is a robot, like when you know it's an actor, real life actor, or think this is a real life actor. So I can imagine if you transfer this to video games, it's indeed what Grant has found very important to know. Are these real players or are these fictive computer generated players behind it? That makes something with you. Yeah,
the uncanny valley stuff is really interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Endgame.
All right. So our next question from ZZ. Any thoughts on the impact of virtual reality and how that might affect one's behavior in real life compared to traditional video games? Is this the final threshold that we're crossing? And now we're going to see mass mayhem, I guess, as a result of virtual reality.
I have very strong feelings about what I call the reality fallacy, that the more real we get, the more efficacy we're going to see. I have written, like the CNN article we were talking about earlier, I've explicitly written about this frustration that people think that if the shooting is more realistic or the relationships are more realistic, if you're talking about love and affection, then somehow we're going to cross some threshold and we're just not going to be able to switch over. And the example I give is actually from life instead of clinical research. And it's that when I was very good at car racing, and I went racing for the first time in the real world, and I absolutely sucked. It took me a while. It took me 2 to 3 races before I had any chance of racing, because no matter how great I was on screen and no matter how many like versions of that simulation approached, it wasn't that the simulation was great. It's that there's a whole lot of other things that had to happen in my head for me to be a good racer, and it had nothing to do with my technical ability to steer a car.
Yeah. I would say, too, the experience of firing a firearm is like that as well. I mean, obviously in the U.S., we have opportunities. I'm not a gun owner, but I like shooting bottles with rifles and stuff. So I've been to ranges and stuff, and just the experience of firing an actual firearm is way more difficult than it looks like in Call of Duty. So it's a very different experience. So the idea that you're going to play Call of Duty, become an expert marksman all of a sudden is a fantasy. Or even know how to load a gun is a kind of a fantasy, somewhat. So that might be an experience that's harder to get in other places other than the U.S. because you walk outside and there's a gun lying around here in the U.S. So, other thoughts on that one, Aaron? And
one more that I would add on, and that is that the focus less so on aggression and anger. I don't buy that. Exactly like Lindsay said, I don't buy that. That wasn't realistic enough, so therefore it doesn't matter. That was obviously that's actually a frequently used mechanism by a particular group of people who don't want you to publish papers showing that where you've got your results that showing violent video games don't create violence. They say, but that game is now 4 years old, so it's now not relevant because it's not as realistic. And of course, that's a load of bollocks because, it takes you a year to get the game. You have to get ethics, you have to get the data, then you have to analyze it. For VR, in the area of clinical psychology, which I'm coming from, they have a general rule, and that is if it involves sex will lead the way. And so, the famous experiment with the rat that had to press an implant into the septal region of the limbic system, and which is the equivalent of giving it an orgasm. And on the other, so it could press this button and get the orgasm, or press that button and get a food pellet. The rat died of starvation, to give you an idea, right? So, with the VR setup, I can see a future where there's VR setups with outfits, with pressure suits, and I think that's going to raise a lot of issues. But it's going to raise more ethical issues than it is on anything else. So I do see that as a possibility down the future. It really is realistic that one day we will be studying this phenomenon.
We're all horrible people laughing at this poor dead smiling rat, so. If God's a rat, we're doomed, I'm telling you.
Wasn't me that did the experiment. This was way back. So.
Yeah. All right, so
Chris, sorry to interrupt. I'm just wary in Australia that we've got a Senate committee hearing going on about gambling and games. I'm happy to throw over to the two, including you, the three that have done a lot of research on this, because my guess is this is going to be something that Australia's going to hear a lot about very soon.
Yeah, so Aaron and Jim, do you want to respond to the problem gaming stuff in Australia?
Aaron, do you want to take?
Yeah, I can say a few things. I can see in the chat someone's asked specifically about loot boxes as well, so I'll kind of respond to that, I guess. Jim and I were one of the first papers that looked at loot boxes in video games and whether or not they approximated kind of traditional gambling activities. And like a lot of stuff we did, we went in quite skeptical that it would be similar to traditional forms of gambling, and very swiftly we were dissuaded of that. We actually found that about 45% of the loot boxes we looked at in our initial paper would meet the criteria for traditional kinds of gambling activities. Now, the question that's been asked here is whether or not that means loot boxes should be banned, and that's a much more nuanced question. I think certainly what we've seen in the data over the last couple of years is a fairly consistent pattern that people who have problem gambling symptoms tend to overspend on loot boxes in particular. And that implies that perhaps people who have problems with gambling are kind of spending more than perhaps they should, or than other users. And there might need to be some discussion about safeguards around those users in particular. We don't yet know whether or not, exposing people to loot boxes is going to lead to problem gambling. I remain fairly skeptical that we're going to end up with people who are engaging in loot box purchasing, transferring over to other kinds of gambling activities, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to protect those vulnerable users who perhaps have gambling problems. So probably bans are a little bit too extreme, and what we're seeing in other countries, I would suggest, is that they're probably not all that effective either. So yeah, I think possibly more to do with consumer advocacy advice and consumer information, so that people have a good understanding of what loot boxes are and are able to make informed decisions for themselves and for their children about whether they're kind of appropriate for them. Jim or Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
I think you nailed it, dude. I mean, I think there are, as you said, there are some clear psychological similarities between some of these loot box mechanisms and more conventional forms of gambling, and for that reason, we're interested in how they affect players' behavior, playtime, spending. There's also some reasonably robust data linking and potentially increased spending to vulnerable populations. So that's again a reason to be interested, but we simply don't know enough about what the even moderate to long term, let alone long term effects of engaging with these mechanisms are. And for that reason, when you're talking about what a appropriate regulatory response might look like, definitely down towards the end of informing decision making, informing consumers about the mechanisms, and a long way away from the idea of blanket bans. That would. I'd agree with basically what you said.
I have a quick question for you guys. I know last year when this came up a lot in the US and I had to do something in DC out there, the thing I kept seeing was that compulsive buying disorder and OCD behaviors were also clumped around the folks who were doing the least healthy loot box behavior. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah, we're getting like high levels of gaming engagement is associated with it. So sort of excessive engagement, whatever that means. I'm not a huge fan of the idea of a game addiction per se, but high levels of usage does tend to be clustered around it. There's less kind of information about other personality traits and OCD behaviors that might be clustered around it, but that's certainly an area worth thinking about.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So let's see. The next one in order here is by Odyssey or something like that. Whatever. And it basically goes, apologies, this has already been addressed. I don't think it has been. Has there been any research showing that violence in games amplifies existing violent tendencies in people rather than directly causing violent behavior? Anybody want to speak to that one?
Chris, that's one for you, surely, with your catalyst model, or Grant?
Exactly. And I've got the imp model, so between us, you go.
Yeah, I would say basically no. There've been a handful of studies that have looked at that issue in various kind of at-risk populations. So I've done a couple that have looked at like kids with pre-existing mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, ADD, or kids that had higher levels of sort of antisocial personality traits or things like that. And even in those populations, we're not able to find any kind of link between, violent video game playing and aggressive behavior. It really came down more to combinations of antisocial traits. With depression was a bad mixture. So try to keep your psychopaths happy is kind of like the bottom line of that. I mean, family environment, that kind of stuff. The more stress people are under, particularly if they have antisocial traits, the more likely they are to engage in violent behavior, but not playing violent video games. And there was one study, I think, that was probably inspired by the Sandy Hook shooting here, where a young man with, allegedly had like Asperger's disorder. And I think it was probably fairly established that he did, but so people kind of started asking, well, do kids with like autism or Asperger's disorder, are they affected by violent video games? And this study kind of looked at that and looked at young adults that had Asperger's or autism spectrum disorders, and basically once again found no evidence that playing violent video games caused this population to become more aggressive compared to the general population of sort of neurotypical individuals. And of course, it also bears noting that autistic individuals are not more likely to be violent or aggressive in the first place. So the evidence we have at this point, I would say, suggests there is not this kind of like at-risk group, if you will, that are more vulnerable to violent video game playing. Grant, what do you think?
It's taken us an hour to find an issue we disagree on. So,
good. All right, awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I think we run out of time here tonight. I appreciate everybody's attention. Now go ahead, Grant.
Okay, but in one of our experiments, what we looked at, if you look at the early gaming research, it wasn't just that it didn't have an effect. There was one group of people that said, oh, look, it has a negative effect. There was one group of people that said it didn't really have an effect. And if you look closely, there was a group of people that seemed to be positive effects from gaming. So we hypothesized three. And we did discriminant function analysis like backway ANOVAs to try and work out which category based on personality people were, that either went up in anger or went down in anger. And we found that they were separated by trait. So if people had the people that changed either went up or went down had high trait aggression. Everybody else, nothing happened. So the people that had high trait aggression or anger, they were the ones that went up or down. And if their state anger was up, they came down. And if their state anger was down, they went up. And it wasn't regression to the mean because the others didn't move either. Mm-hmm. So we could, if you've got a kid that's high trait anger and they're currently very high, gaming actually brought them down. And if they were high trait anger and they were quite low, putting them in front of a game wound them up. So that's the only bit that we found. So
okay,
so slight difference there.
Yeah, that's all good. That's cool. I think we are at this point technically past our due date, our expiration date. We're at our kill date. We're at our
voluntary redundancy
here. We're not going away. We're just not going to be here anymore. So I think that we have to say, again, we didn't get to everybody's questions. I mean, I do appreciate, we all appreciate you guys giving us some questions to sink our teeth into here. Certainly, wish we could have gotten to all of them, but, better to have too many than too few. Absolutely. We all appreciate your time. And this has been a lot of fun. I had a lot of, it's almost 2 a.m. I'm now wound up. I can't go to bed now. So this has been great. I hope that you all feel the same way about it. I don't know if anybody else has any last thoughts before we sign off.
Just thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for
moderating, Chris. Thanks for doing it.
All right, cool.
Thank you very much.
So I think we're supposed to wave really, really, it's a signal that we're